And we are now joined by Benjamin Engel. Is that the right way I pronounced your last name?
Yep.
Because it sounds very like a German last name.
So Friedrich Engels, one of the Karl Marx's kind of co-author of the theory of, socialism. So yeah, very close to that.
Okay, so happy to see you, and you're here for MIK or Made It Korea. So let me give you our listeners our brief introduction of what we're going to talk about today. On November 29th, 1987, Korean Air Flight 858 exploded over the Andaman Sea just off the coast of Myanmar. The flight was carrying 104 passengers and 11 crew members, or 115 people in total, all of whom perished. Although initially the cause of the explosion was unclear, subsequent investigations revealed that the explosion was no accident. 2 North Korean agents had boarded the flight at its initial departure point of Baghdad and disembarked during a stopover in Abu Dhabi, leaving behind in an overhead storage bin a time bomb disguised as a bottle of wine. The plane departed Abu Dhabi for Bangkok, where it was to refuel, but it never reached Bangkok. Although the North Korean agents had tried to commit suicide after being captured, one of them, a woman named Kim Hyon-hui, was not killed by the poison she ingested and was brought to South Korea to stand trial. So today we will discuss this blatant act of terrorism and inter-Korean relations as well at the end of the Cold War. So to begin with, Ben, can you give us some details about the course of events? So what exactly happened in November 1987? How did North Korean agents get a bomb onto this Korean Airlines flight?
Right. As you mentioned, Korean Air Flight 858, or KAL 858 as it's often called, departed from Baghdad at 11:30 p.m. It was scheduled to stop twice in Abu Dhabi and then in Bangkok before arriving in Seoul. 2 North Korean agents, Kim Sung-il and Kim Hyun-hui, boarded the plane. They left a time bomb disguised as a radio next to a bottle of liquid explosives, which was disguised as a bottle of wine, to increase the size of the explosion. The bomb was left in an overhead bin above their seats, and they got off the plane at Abu Dhabi. Then the plane took off and was flying to Bangkok for refueling, but the explosion happened, as you said, over the Andaman Sea, which is a body of water between Myanmar and India, which is broadly a part of the Indian Ocean. And I think we have a picture of that location for those of you listening on YouTube.
So maybe we can take a look at the picture now of, you said, the exact location?
Right.
In a bit.
Okay.
Okay.
Anyway, just to explain a little bit more, the first newspaper reports on KAL 858 in Korea speculated about the possibility of it having been hijacked or accidentally crashing. All that was known was that it wasn't responding and never reached Bangkok. On December 1st, 1987, so just 2 days after it exploded, newspapers reported that the crash site had been located off the coast of southern Myanmar and not far from Bangkok, which we have the picture here now for those of you on YouTube. You can see at this point, Myanmar is just this very little sliver of territory. And then just inside of that is where Thailand. And so you can see that it almost made it to Bangkok and was almost over land when it exploded. I guess it might be a small mercy that it exploded over the ocean instead of crashing into maybe a village or something in Myanmar. In any case, the Korean newspapers on December 2nd began reporting that a Japanese man and woman were being investigated in Bahrain in connection with KAL 858. These were, in fact, the 2 North Korean agents, but they had been traveling using counterfeit Japanese passports. They traveled to Bahrain from Abu Dhabi in an attempt to escape. However, the Bahrain authorities detained them on the suspicion that their passports were fake, and because they were initially reported as Japanese, the suspicion in Korea at first was that the North Korean agents were Japanese citizens or Korean Japanese associated with the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, which in Korean is called the 제1본 조선인 총연합회, or 조총령, which we often call it for short. This is a pro-North Korea organization in Japan. On December 3rd, Korean newspapers reported that the Japanese man had committed suicide by poisoning. He had bitten down on a cyanide pill that he was carrying just in case of a situation like this. But the Japanese female, Hachiya Mayumi, who was really Kim Hyon-hui, had regained consciousness after also attempting suicide. On December 16th, Kim Hyon-hui arrived in Seoul after the Bahrain police turned her over to Korean authorities because of her connection with the KAL 858 incident. But South Korean newspapers were still reporting her as being Japanese woman named Mayumi. It wasn't until January 16th, 1988, over a month after the incident happened, that the Korean media informed the people that Mayumi was really a North Korean agent. Kim Hyon-hui told the world during a press conference held by the South Korean spy agency her real name and that of her accomplice, and that they had been ordered to plant the bombs on the personal order of Kim Jong-il himself, who was, of course, Kim Il-sung's son, and at that point, the future leader of North Korea.
Right. I do remember the interview, not, of course, at that time because I wasn't born then, but of course, this interview was quite shocking for many people in Korea for years and years. That's why we still talk about this incident, and especially because of the families of the victims. So who were the victims on Korean Air Flight 858? And particularly looking at the attack from a contemporary vantage point, it might be a little odd to think that over 100 Koreans were actually flying from Baghdad to Seoul.
Yeah, to answer this question, we have to actually talk about how South Korea went through its economic modernization process. We tend to focus on Korea being an export-oriented economic growth strategy. And we talked about that last week, how in the 1970s, Korea was producing a lot of textiles and things, and we talked about Jeontaeil. But as we get into the 1980s, South Korea began really collecting a lot of contracts in the Middle East. So many South Korean companies were engaged in these infrastructure projects, such as building highways, ports, or housing complexes. And in conjunction with these contracts, thousands of Korean workers began moving to the Middle East to build these facilities or factories or whatever it was. According to one article from 1984, there were some 147,000 South Koreans working on various projects throughout the Middle East. In time, South Korean construction companies would begin to lose contracts in the Middle East as companies from other, maybe less developed countries were able to underbid South Korean companies. But in contemporary times, for those of you who follow the news, probably know that South Korea has shifted to providing more technologically advanced products to the Middle East, namely nuclear power plants. In 2009, South Korea inked its first deal to build a nuclear power plant in the United Arab Emirates. In any case, getting back to KAL 858, Korean newspapers at the time noted that a vast majority of the victims were indeed Korean workers returning home from the Middle East or coming back to visit their families. 55 of the Koreans who perished were employed by Hyundai Engineering and Construction, and another 8 were Samsung employees.
That explains. So now we're going to look at why North Korea did this. So to understand why North Korea would do something like this, perhaps it's best to look at the situation from a broader perspective. What was the state of inter-Korean relations in the late 1980s, and why would Pyongyang commit such a heinous crime?
Yeah, so for those of you who were listening a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the tunnels in North Korea, you might remember how I mentioned the January 1968 assassination attempt on Park Chung-hee, which was followed immediately by the capture of the USS Pueblo. So there were many incidents in the late 1960s, and then in August 1976, we had the infamous axe murder incident in the Joint Security Area where 2 American officers were hacked to death by North Koreans armed with axes and clubs. While all of these incidents had a sort of military quality to them, it should be noted that North Korea was not above attacking or kidnapping ordinary civilians before the KAL 858 bombing. North Korea hijacked a domestic Korean airline flight in South Korea in 1969, and North Korea was frequently seizing South Korean fishing vessels with civilians on board. And perhaps most famously, North Korea kidnapped not only South Korean civilians and brought them to North Korea, but civilians of other countries, most notably Japan. So terror against civilians was definitely in the North Korean repertoire, but they had never done something as heinous or large scale as the KAL 858 bombing. But there are 2 other factors to keep in mind when we think about the timing of the attack. The first was the South Korean presidential election. So students of Korean history will recognize that this attack came just months after the June 29th declaration, which signaled South Korea's transition to democracy. And it came only 3 weeks before the December 16th, 1980 presidential election, which was the first free and open presidential election that Korea had had in decades. So North Korea may have wanted to make its presence felt when South Koreans went to the poll. The other factor was definitely the upcoming Seoul Olympics in 1988. The Seoul Olympics were not only a coming out party to show off South Korea's economic development, but they were going to be the first Olympics attended by both free and communist bloc countries in a decade. The 1980 Moscow Olympics were boycotted by the U.S. and its allies after the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, and the Soviet bloc countries boycotted the 1984 Olympics in in Los Angeles in response. So both with the Soviet-U.S. relations improving and the Cold War winding down, the Seoul Olympics were going to be a symbol of a new and more cooperative international order, which is something that North Korea was not really interested in.
So speaking of the Seoul Olympics in 1988, what was the fallout of the attack? Did the games, were they impacted by this attack?
Yeah, in the end, the terrorist attack didn't have a major impact on the Seoul Olympics. Both the South Korean and U.S. governments made strong statements about ensuring the safety of the Olympics. And given the air of cooperation between the U.S., Soviet Union, and China at the time, there appears to have been quiet pressure applied by the two large communist powers on North Korea not to create any further incidents ahead of the Olympics in Seoul. And indeed, there were no further provocations. Beyond the Olympics, the attack was another ding into North Korea's already deteriorating international reputation. The views of the two Koreas by the First and Second World were always colored by the Cold War, but the Third World, or non-aligned movement, in the early part of the Cold War, North Korea is actually seen as the better Korea for much of the 1960s. Since South Korea remained a host to U.S. troops and fought in Vietnam alongside the U.S. in the 1960s and early 1970s, it was seen by many post-colonial states in particular as aiding U.S. imperialism. The two Koreas engaged in a sort of diplomatic war in the 1970s for official recognition by other states, just as Taiwan and China do to this day. And North Korea was doing better in this war, at least through the early 1970s. However, the axe murder incident in 1976 was kind of a turning point in the eyes of many. The brutality of the murder put North Korea in a painted North Korea in a very unfavorable light. Then the Yangon bombing of 1983 made things even worse for North Korea. In 1983, North Korea tried to assassinate then South Korean president or military dictator Chun Doo-hwan while he was visiting Myanmar. They planted a bomb in a roof of the Martyrs Mausoleum, which commemorates one of the founders of Myanmar, Aung San. The assassination attempt, coupled with the disregard for the sacred site of Myanmar, again greatly damaged North Korea's reputation. And then we have the KAL 1858 incident, which drugged North Korea's reputation just even further.
I see. And Ben, outside of the obvious tragedy, of course, there was another interesting result of the bombing of KAL 858, which was the confessed terrorist Kim Hyon-hui. She became a very well-known figure in South Korea and really the world. So what happened to Kim after she confessed to the bombing?
Yeah, Kim Hyon-hui lived a really interesting life. I guess she's living a really interesting life because she's still alive. Kim Hyon-hui was the daughter of a relatively high-positioned family in North Korea. She was originally trained as an actress and actually starred in a movie. And most people in South Korea seemed to find her quite attractive. When she committed the heinous crime, she was only in her mid-20s. However, when she was still in North Korea, she later entered the intelligence service and spent several years in training before being selected for the KAL 858 mission, I guess, from the North Korean perspective. And the story of her confession is quite amazing as well. The fake passport, her attempted suicide, and the autopsy of her male companion gave investigators the clues they needed to conclude that she was really from North Korea. When she arrived in South Korea, interrogators allowed her to watch TV and tour downtown Seoul. After this, South Korean authorities said that she came to realize that she had been duped and used by the North Korean government. According to a statement given by the Korean government to the UN Security Council in early 1988, on December 23rd, 8 days after arriving in South Korea, Kim Hyon-hui suddenly threw herself into the arms of a female investigator and said, speaking in Korean for the first time because she was pretending to be Chinese actually, "Forgive me, I'm sorry." Afterwards, she allegedly voluntarily offered up a confession and detailed information. In March 1989, she was sentenced to death by a South Korean court for her terrorism. However, she was later pardoned 1 year later by South Korean President Roh Tae-woo, who said she was equally a victim of brainwashing by the North Korean government. She published an autobiography in 1991 with the help of the South Korean intelligence service and a ghostwriter, and donated part of the proceeds to families of the victims of the KAL 858 incident. She toured South Korea on a book tour afterwards and became quite an instrument in government or right-wing groups' anti-North Korean propaganda efforts. While she was being trained as a spy, Kim learned Japanese from one of the Japanese civilians who was abducted by the North Korean government. And in 2010, she visited Japan to speak with the family of one of these abductees. Later on, she would marry one of her bodyguards initially assigned to her after arrival in South Korea, and they had 2 children. To this day, she lives in South Korea in an undisclosed location because it's feared that the North Korean government would still like to assassinate her for her betrayal of them. And unfortunately, her family in North Korea has not fared well. According to Kim Hyon-hui, she told the BBC in 2013 that her family in North Korea had been arrested and sent to labor camps for what she did.
So she must have been undergoing a very big transformation her entire life, and also how she thinks about the North Korean regime back then and now, right? Do you remember maybe the most recent time she was on South Korean media?
I saw a clip on YouTube of her being on right about this time, commemorating the bombing of KAL 858. She was on YTN giving a short statement, continuing to repeat her apologies for what she had done, to repeat that she was, had been used by the North Korean government, that she didn't really understand what she was doing. She was taught that she was going to be bringing unification to the Korean Peninsula through her actions, and it wasn't until she got to South Korea that she realized that she had just been lied to her entire life.
And also, I remember that the story of the KAL explosion was on a Korean TV program recently, where they talk about stories from the past. That, as you just mentioned, YTN, and this one was from JTBC, I remember. And it is still a shocking incident until this day. That is why it is still appearing in recent media, and because it is affecting the family members, of course, of the victims until this day. So how is the bombing of KAL 858 remembered today? In a sense, it is sort of an unresolved issue because the plane was never recovered and North Korea never officially took responsibility for the attack, right?
Right, as you said, some of the wreckage that was floating on the top was recovered, but the plane's fuselage sank to the bottom of the ocean and no bodies were ever recovered. In January 2020, a report by South Korean broadcaster MBC reported that they had found the exact location of the KAL 858 wreckage. However, the South Korean government was unable to secure cooperation from the Myanmar government to bring the plane back. North Korea has been unrepentant. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the North Korean government alleged that the whole thing was concocted by the South Korean spy agency, that there was never a real plane, and rather the South Korean government just sprinkled debris on the ocean. They never acknowledged that Kim Hyon-hui was a North Korean agent either, and they even charged Japan with aiding South Korea in the plot, since the passports that they were using were Japanese. Interestingly, however, North Korea is not the only actor to cry foul. There continue to be rumors in South Korea that the bombing of KAL 858 was not necessarily faked, but that it was an operation conducted by the South Korean spy agency to help Roh Tae-woo win the 1987 election. As I mentioned before, the bombing of KAL 858 took place just before the election, and it is widely believed that the incident would help the conservatives win votes, as they are the party that is tough on North Korea. As a result of these rumors, in 2005, the National Intelligence Service Truth Commission investigated the case again and did indeed include that it was a North Korean operation. Another investigation took place in 2008 and reached the same conclusion, but in 2007, declassified Korean government documents from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs brought to light the so-called Operation Rainbow. These documents for this operation clearly outlined a plan to use the KAL 858 bombing to isolate North Korea internationally and influence the South Korean presidential election. Not all the documents are related to Operation Rainbow, as have been declassified yet, leaving a bit of an air of mystery around the whole ordeal.
So it looks like maybe in the years to come, there could be new details coming out of this incident. Now, in addition to the bombing of KAL 858, you also mentioned the Yangon bombing of 1983 and other examples of North Korean terrorism. But thinking about the last decade or 20 years or so, we don't really see this type of behavior by North Korea anymore. I mean, we do have missile tests, even nuclear tests, and attacks related to the North Korean military, such as the shelling of the Yeonpyeong Island, which occurred back in November 2010. But we don't really see North Korean terrorism against civilian targets anymore. Is there any reason for that?
Yeah, I think these attacks against civilians ended in 1987 mainly because South Korea's transition to democracy. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, I think the North Korean government under Kim Il-sung clung to hope that a communist revolution may be realized in South Korea because of the repressive nature of the military governments. However, this never materialized. Moreover, the terrorist attacks always seemed to create unity in South Korea against North Korea rather than resulting in divisions in South Korea's society, which is what the North Koreans might have been hoping for. Other issues may be North Korea's nuclear weapons program, the famine of the 1990s, and the war on terror, the American war on terror in the post 9/11 world. With the development of its nuclear weapons, provocative actions by North Korea would have become more dangerous. A war on the Korean Peninsula has the possibility now to escalate to nuclear war very rapidly. And I think this forces North Korea to be more careful about when, where, and how it provokes South Korea and the U.S. And in the 1990s, with the deepening famine, I also think that North Korea, A, was running out of resources to engage in these types of plots, and B, was going to need to begin repairing its image because it was going to require international assistance if it was going to survive the desperate economic conditions that they were suffering. And then after 9/11, September 11th, 2001, engaging in terrorism has become a much costlier affair. We saw George W. Bush include North Korea in his axis of evil and then quickly demolish one of those countries in Iraq. With the U.S. taking terrorism more seriously and responding actively and decisively to state sponsors of terror, the type of acts like KAL 858 bombing would have been viewed by North Korean leaders as very costly without much benefit.
I mean, it is, of course, good that we do not see any of these terrorisms against civilians. But North Korea, of course, remains on the list of the U.S.'s list of countries that are conducting acts of terrorism.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned it, but this incident was why it first got on that list. So the United States government first listed North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism in 1988 because of the KAL 858 bombing.
That is a very good point. And since then, it has, I think, been on that list ever since, right?
There was a period in the middle, 2008 to 2017, where the U.S. temporarily removed them, hoping to push dialogue forward. But in 2017, they were placed back on it and remain there to this day.
I see. So nevertheless, although we do not see these acts anymore, it was a very, very difficult time for the South Korean people and the victims. And that is why I think it was very significant today to hear the details of the story, because you really went through all of the details why this happened and the background of, for instance, I wasn't really sure about why we had so many South Koreans on that specific plane. So thank you very much for going through this with us today, Ben. And I hope to talk to you anytime soon.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Soa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang radio application or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.